Again, looking at the names of Jehovah, a combination of those names. Again, Jehovah is always Lord, all capital letters, or God, all capital letters. Last week, just by way of review, we looked at Jehovah Sabaoth. It's a name that occurs 245 times in the Old Testament. 125 of them are in the book of Isaiah. It's translated Lord of Hosts. It is stated 9 times the Lord of Hosts is his name. The Lord of Hosts is his name. We read in Psalm 24 and verse 10, the Lord of Hosts, he is the King of glory. We also read in Psalm 84:3, the Lord of Hosts, my God, or my King, and my God. So he is the Lord of Hosts. We read in Isaiah 1:24, the Lord of Hosts, the mighty one of Israel. Notice in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah 6 and verse 3, and one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord, all capital letters, Jehovah of Hosts. So in the Hebrew that would be Jehovah Sabaoth. The whole earth is full of his glory. And then in Isaiah chapter 47, Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 4. As for our Redeemer, so that's the subject, our Redeemer, the Lord of Hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. So it is a name that declares him to be the Almighty, sovereign, all-possessing, all-controlling God. So it's a name that manifests his sovereignty. Then we looked at the name Jehovah Elohenu, the Lord, all caps, our God. Jehovah, our Elohim. It is the Lord, our God. First person, plural. He's our God. It's a name that occurs 92 times in the Old Testament. We read in Psalm 90, verse 17, the beauty of the Lord our God. The beauty of the Lord our God. We are called upon in Psalm 99, 5, and also verse 9, exalt the Lord our God. But then notice in Psalm 113, in verse 5, who is like unto the Lord, there it is, all caps, our God, who dwelleth on high. So it's a name that occurs more in Deuteronomy than anywhere else. The Lord our God. And that's important to recognize because Deuteronomy, of course, is a reiteration of Israel's history. And it goes back to the Lord our God. And we look back at our own history. and it's the same thing. The Lord our God. As you go through the book of Deuteronomy, you see that the Lord our God commanded, the Lord our God gave unto us, the Lord our God delivered us, the Lord our God hath showed us His glory, and the Lord our God God is one Lord. So again, but it all goes back to the Lord our God. And everything in our life goes back to the Lord our God. And that brings us to Jehovah Elohika. It's translated the Lord thy God. Very closely related, of course, to the Lord our God. But here it's the Lord thy God. So it's second person. It occurs 297 times in the Old Testament. And of those, 233 are in the book of Deuteronomy. So once again, the Lord our God appears more in Deuteronomy than any other book. The Lord thy God, by far, appears more in Deuteronomy than any other book. And again, it's a reiteration of Israel's history. 233 times in the book of Deuteronomy, the Lord thy God. Reiterating Israel's history, he's reminding them it's all due to the Lord thy God. So let's look at some of these verses in Deuteronomy. Again, we said it appears 233 times. Certainly not going to look at 233 verses. But let's look at some of them. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, Deuteronomy chapter 1, and verse 31. Deuteronomy 1, verse 31. And in the wilderness, where thou hast seen how that the Lord thy God, and then notice what he did. The Lord thy God bare thee. That is, he carried thee. Then he makes a comparison. As a man doth bear his son or carry his son, in all the way that ye went. The Lord thy God bare thee or carried thee in all the way that ye went until you came unto this place. That is, he led you unto this place by carrying you there. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7. For the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. And we can look back on our lives and say the same thing. The Lord thy God hath blessed thee in all the works of thy hand. He knoweth thy walking through this great wilderness. He knows the way. These 40 years, the Lord thy God, there it is again, twice in this verse, hath been with thee all through the 40 years. He was there with them. When they rebelled, he was with them. And then it goes on, thou hast lacked nothing. They had what they needed. Oh, there were times when they moaned and groaned and griped, but they never lacked. They had what they needed. And so it is with you and I. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29. But if thou from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him. If thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Looking back on our lives, the Lord thy God has been with us every step of the way. That should result in us seeking him. Seeking him first. That's what it means with all thy heart. You seek Him first. He's not the fire escape. He's not the last option. You seek Him first. Again, as we've preached many times, He's never to be next. He's always to be first. And I don't care what it is. He's always to be first, never next. If it's seeking advice, He's to be first, not next. You don't seek 15 people's opinion and then seek the Lord. You seek Him first, never next. Then notice in verse 31, Deuteronomy chapter 4, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God. He will not forsake thee, neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers. In other words, He's faithful, which He sware unto them. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6. This is God speaking. I am the Lord thy God, Jehovah Elohika, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. God was the Redeemer. They didn't redeem themselves, but it was the Lord thy God from the house of bondage. Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. That's a command from God. None of us have done it. We've never loved the Lord with all our heart, with all of our heart. Again, if you think you have a different definition of all your heart than I do. But we are to be growing, getting closer and closer to loving Him with all our heart. Verse 13, thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, and serve Him, and shalt swear by His name. Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. For thou art a holy people, separate and pure, unto the Lord thy God. That should describe our whole life. Unto the Lord thy God. Then you have it again. The Lord thy God. We're to be unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto Himself. Unto Him. Again, everything is unto Him. Above all the people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set, that is the Lord thy God, that's the context. The Lord did not set His love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were the fewest. But because the Lord, Jehovah, loved you, that's why He chose you, because He loved you. So people say, well, I don't know why God chose me. He chose you because He loved you. Well, I don't know why God loved me. He loved you because He wanted to. It had nothing to do with you. And that is plain throughout Scripture. Notice in verse 9, know therefore that the Lord thy God, know this, He is God. He is God. Know that the Lord thy God, He is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love Him, and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. Notice verse 19. The great temptations which thine eyes saw, and the signs, and the wonders, and the mighty hand, and the stretched out arm, whereby the Lord thy God brought thee out. So shall the Lord thy God do unto all the people of whom thou art afraid. This is what the Lord thy God did in the past. You can depend upon Him to do so in the future. Deuteronomy 8 verse 2. Thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years. Remember, don't forget. In the wilderness, He did this to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep His commandments or no. In verse 18, but thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is He that giveth thee power or ability to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant, which He sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. In Deuteronomy 10 and verse 12. And now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God? That's number one requirement. Fear Him, reverence Him, to walk in all His ways, and to love Him and serve the Lord thy God. 3 times in that verse, the Lord thy God, with all thy heart and with all thy soul. Verse 20. He is thy praise, He is thy God, that hath done for thee these great and terrible things, which thine eyes have seen. That's verse 21. And verse 20 is a repeat. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, thou shalt serve and to Him, and thou shalt cleave and swear by His name. Deuteronomy 11, verse 1. Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and keep His charge and His statutes and His judgments and His commandments always. Always. Deuteronomy 12, verse 7. And there shall ye eat before the Lord your God, and ye shall rejoice in all that ye put your hand unto ye, and your households wherein the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. So it's over and over and over we see this phrase, the Lord thy God. Notice in Deuteronomy 20, and again it occurs 233 times in the book of Deuteronomy. So you could say that's really the subject of the book of Deuteronomy, is the Lord thy God. The idea, of course, is to review their history. But the subject of all of that is the Lord thy God. And so it is with our lives as well. Verse 1 of chapter 20, when thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots, and a people more than thou, be not afraid of them, for the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee. Reminding them again, He brought you out. He saved your soul. If He saved your soul, which is the greatest miracle there is no greater miracle than the salvation of a soul. If He did that, what can't He do? That's the greatest miracle there is. It's greater than creation. The salvation of a soul. Notice in Deuteronomy 23, in verse 5. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God, so again twice in this verse, turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. 3 times the Lord thy God. He turned the curse into a blessing. God does that all the time. God turns what we ruin into something good. And the reason? Because the Lord thy God loved thee. That's the reason. Notice in chapter 26. Verse 10. And now, behold, I have brought the firstfruits of the land, which thou, O Lord, notice all caps, O Jehovah, hast given me. And thou shalt set it before the Lord thy God. What God has given you, you set it before Jehovah thy God. And worship before the Lord thy God. There is no such thing as worship if it is not before the Lord. If you take the Lord out of the equation, you don't worship. So it is worship before. That speaks of our position. It's a preposition. Speaking of our position, before the Lord thy God. And notice in chapter 27. Verse 7. And thou shalt offer peace offerings, and shalt eat there, and rejoice before the Lord thy God. Verse 10. Thou shalt therefore obey the voice of the Lord thy God, and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day. Chapter 28, verse 2. And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee if thou hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. And then in chapter 16, if we go over there, Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy 16. Again, the whole idea is in the reiteration of their history, to focus upon the Lord thy God. Review your history. Review your life. And do so focusing upon the Lord thy God. See his hand in everything. The Lord thy God. And when you view life, review your life through the lens of the Lord thy God. What a wonderful life that God has blessed us with. But here in Deuteronomy 16, the name the Lord thy God occurs 20 times. 20 times in one chapter. So you can definitely say that chapter 16, the focus, the subject is the Lord thy God. But I believe that's so throughout the whole book. That's the subject. The Lord thy God. But notice, verse 1, you see, keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. Everything is to be unto him. Again, everything's to be moving in his direction. It's Romans 12, 1 and 2. We're to separate ourselves unto God. Unto him. That's what we separate to. Doesn't matter what you separate from if you do not separate to the Lord. I'm not saying it doesn't matter what you separate from, but I'm saying, listen carefully, it doesn't matter what you separate from if it's not to, if it's not unto the Lord. It has to be moving in that direction. Notice verse 2. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God. Then verse 5. Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Verse 6. But at the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. He's talking about worship. He's talking about giving unto God. And it was, he says in verse 5, you can't just do that any place. But you have to do it in the place that the Lord thy God shall choose. That was the tabernacle. Later it was the temple. Today it's the church. You can't just do what you want. But it's a place where God shall choose. And that's reiterated over and over through the book of Deuteronomy. Verse 7, thou shalt roast and eat it in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Verse 8, 6 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day shall be a solemn assembly. Notice that word, to. Again, that's the direction. The Lord thy God. A solemn assembly. A serious assembly. Nothing frivolous about it. It's a solemn assembly to the Lord thy God. Verse 10, thou shalt keep the feast of weeks unto the Lord thy God. Verse 11, and thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God. Again, he's basically speaking about worship. Verse 15, we see 7 days shalt thou keep a solemn feast unto the Lord thy God. Unto the Lord thy God. In the place which the Lord Jehovah shall choose, because the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thine increase, and all the works of thy hands. Therefore thou shalt surely rejoice. Verse 16, 3 times in a year shall all the males appear before. Again, that's position. The Lord thy God, in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread. Verse 17, every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. Now you think about that. Every man give as he's able. Okay, and then people would say, well, I'm not able, I got this going on, this. But then read on. According to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. If we gave according, and I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking about anything. If we gave according, in accord, in a line with the blessing of the Lord thy God, we'd have to give it all. And then you still haven't given enough. You give it all and you still have not given enough. Then notice verse 18. Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout the tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Verse 20, that which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Verse 21, thou shalt not plant thee a grove or any trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God. Verse 22, neither shalt thou set thee up any image which the Lord thy God hateth. So it's just over and over and over. The Lord thy God. Again, a reiteration of their history. A reiteration of their life. And over, the Lord thy God. Don't forget. Look at your life. See God's hand in your life. Don't be oblivious to the Lord in your life. As you look back on your life, you see Romans 8:28, all things working together for good. As you look back on your life and bring it forward to today, you can connect the dots. And you see over and over the Lord thy God. He's been everywhere in our lives. And to me, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is about. It's a reminder. I mean, all the commentators will tell you that the main thing, it's a repetition of law. And that's true, it is. And it's a reiteration of their history. And that's true, it is. But that's not it. That's not the subject. 233 times in one book. The Lord thy God. That's the subject. That's the focus. That's the idea. And it's a lesson to us. That needs to be the focus as we look at our life. And as you look at your past life and you see how God connects the dots, how God connects the events, that should encourage you to trust Him and be assured that everything's going to work out because of the Lord thy God. Let's look to the Lord. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for this day.